In March of 2025, a press conference in Bologna, Italy, produced one of the most viral archaeological claims in recent memory. A retired organic chemist and a remote sensing researcher stood in front of cameras and announced that satellite radar had detected an entire hidden underground world buried nearly 2,000 feet beneath the Pyramid of Khafra at Giza. Vertical shafts wrapped in spiral staircases, they said. Massive cube-shaped chambers 90 meters across. An interconnected network stretching almost 2 kilometers beneath the plateau, potentially linking all 3 major pyramids together into a single, coordinated ancient structure nobody had ever suspected existed. Some online commentators went even further, speculating that the geometric chambers might have functioned as some kind of resonating chamber tuned to Earth's natural electromagnetic frequency. Essentially, an ancient power plant humming away beneath the desert for thousands of years, undetected until now. The claim exploded across the internet within days, discussed on major podcasts with audiences in the millions, shared by prominent public figures and commentators, framed by some as possible confirmation of an ancient legend called the Hall of Records, an imagined repository of lost knowledge said to be buried somewhere beneath Giza, a concept popularized decades earlier by the American psychic Edgar Cayce. Within a single news cycle, it had been picked up by outlets ranging from fringe conspiracy platforms to major mainstream commentators, discussed on shows with some of the largest audiences in the world. And yet, if you go looking for the actual peer-reviewed data behind that claim, the raw radar readings, the independent replication, the published methodology, any other qualified scientist could check for themselves, you'll find almost none of it. What you'll find instead is one of the clearest, most instructive collisions between viral science communication and the actual, much slower, much more skeptical process real scientific verification requires. Let's be precise about who made this claim and why it carried more weight than the usual internet rumor. The Khafre project, as it came to be called, was led by Corrado Malanga, a retired professor of organic chemistry from the University of Pisa, working alongside Filippo Biondi, a remote sensing researcher associated with the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, and a third collaborator named Armando May. This wasn't their first attempt at this kind of work. In 2022, Malanga and Biondi had actually published a peer-reviewed paper in the academic journal Remote Sensing, describing a technique they called a synthetic aperture radar Doppler tomography, which they claimed could reveal previously undiscovered internal structures within the Great Pyramid of Khufu using satellite radar data. That earlier paper gave their 2025 announcement about the Khafre Pyramid an unusual amount of built-in credibility. These weren't total outsiders with no scientific background at all. They had real academic credentials and at least one prior publication that had genuinely passed through some form of peer review. It's worth being fair about that earlier paper, though, because even at the time, it drew its own share of scrutiny within the small community of specialists who work with satellite radar professionally. Peer review, particularly for a genuinely novel proposed technique applied to an unusual application like this one, doesn't automatically mean every claim within a paper has been independently replicated or universally accepted by the broader field, only that reviewers judge the methodology sound enough and the writing rigorous enough to merit publication and further discussion. That distinction between passing peer review and achieving broad scientific consensus turned out to matter enormously once Malanga and Biondi's far more dramatic 2025 claims about the Khafre Pyramid reached a mainstream audience that had no easy way to independently evaluate either the original 2022 paper or the unpublished 2025 announcement that followed it. According to Malanga and Biondi's own description of their method, synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, works by having a satellite send pulses of radar energy toward the ground and then measuring how much of that energy reflects back, along with tiny variations in timing and phase. Traditional radar has real, well-established uses in archaeology. It's been used successfully for years to detect buried structures relatively close to the surface, mapping subtle differences in soil density or moisture that indicate something is buried underneath. Ground-penetrating radar, a related but distinct technology operated from directly on the surface rather than from orbit, has similarly proven genuinely valuable for archaeologists surveying sites for potential excavation without disturbing the ground first. What Malanga and Biondi claimed to have developed was something considerably more ambitious, a proprietary method they called Doppler tomography, supposedly capable of interpreting satellite radar signals in a way that could detect structures buried not just a few feet down, but up to 2 kilometers beneath solid rock and sand using nothing but data collected from satellites orbiting some 420 miles above the surface of the Earth, converting reflected radar signals into what they described as phononic information capable of detecting millimetric vibrations within the stone itself. That claim, specifically the idea that satellite radar could see clearly through more than 1.5 miles of solid limestone bedrock, is exactly where the scientific community's skepticism concentrated almost immediately, and for good reason, grounded in basic, well-established physics. Professor Lawrence Conyers, a radar specialist at the University of Denver who has spent decades using ground-penetrating radar specifically for archaeological research, was blunt when reporters asked him about the claims. He explained that the underlying technology simply isn't capable of penetrating anywhere close to that deep into solid ground, and he described the idea that it had proven the existence of some kind of hidden underground city as a huge exaggeration. This isn't a matter of opinion or professional rivalry. Radar signals lose energy as they travel through dense material, and the deeper a signal needs to penetrate, the weaker and more degraded the returning echo becomes until, past a certain depth, there simply isn't enough usable signal left to reconstruct anything meaningful, regardless of how sophisticated your software happens to be. Multiple other geophysicists and archaeologists interviewed in the weeks following the announcement raised this exact same fundamental objection, independent of one another. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former Minister of Antiquities and one of the most prominent Egyptologists in the world, went even further, publicly stating that no radar devices or modern technologies had actually been used to properly detect any structures beneath the Khafra pyramid at all, and describing the entire claim as an attempt to undermine ancient Egyptian civilization. Hussein Abdelbasir, director of the Antiquities Museum at Egypt's Bibliotheca Alexandrina, characterized the claims as falling squarely within the realm of exaggeration and deception. Dr. Flint Dibble, a working archaeologist and science communicator who has spent considerable time addressing pseudo-archaeological claims for a general audience, pointed out something important about why this particular story caught fire the way it did. An audience already primed for years by persistent rumors of mysterious, hidden chambers beneath the pyramids was exactly the right audience to receive a claim like this one, regardless of whether the underlying science actually supported it. It's worth noting, in fairness, that not every voice in this debate lined up neatly on one side. Some independent commentators and researchers, sympathetic to alternative archaeological theories, pushed back against what they viewed as reflexive dismissal from mainstream Egyptologists, arguing that some critics, including Hawass himself, were weighing in on a highly technical remote sensing question, despite having no personal background or training in that specific field, and that legitimate scientific disagreement was being conflated, unfairly, with outright hostility toward alternative history in general. That's a fair point about who is best qualified to evaluate a highly specific technical claim. But it doesn't change the core problem sitting underneath the entire controversy. Regardless of who is doing the criticizing, the fundamental issue remains that Malanga, Biondi, and May have not released the underlying raw data or full methodology for other qualified remote sensing specialists, not just Egyptologists, to independently verify. Then came a detail that, for many observers, settled the matter almost entirely on its own. One of the most widely shared images supporting the Khafra project's claims, a dramatic cross-section illustration showing the pyramid above ground with an elaborate network of shafts and chambers glowing beneath it, was examined by the fact-checking organization Snopes using an AI detection platform called Hive Moderation. The analysis returned a 99.9% probability that the image had been generated using artificial intelligence, not produced from actual radar data at all. Snopes' formal investigation concluded plainly that, despite the popularity of the claim, there was no credible evidence to support it, and that no credible news outlets or established scientific publications had independently verified any part of the story. It's worth pausing here on exactly what that means and what it doesn't mean. It doesn't necessarily mean Malanga, Biondi, and May set out deliberately to deceive anyone. It's entirely possible that an illustrator working from their described findings created an artistic visualization to accompany the press conference, the way scientific announcements often include simplified graphics to help a general audience understand complex data, without that visualization being intended as a literal, unedited radar readout. But once that detail became public, it added yet another layer of legitimate doubt to a claim that was already resting on genuinely shaky scientific ground, precisely because the researchers never released the underlying raw data, the full processing methodology, or any pathway for other qualified scientists to independently verify the results themselves. In modern science, that kind of transparency isn't an optional courtesy. It's the entire mechanism by which an extraordinary claim gets separated from a mistaken one, or a fabricated one. And right now, for this particular claim, that verification process simply hasn't happened. There's also the matter of formal permission and process, which matters more than it might initially seem. Egypt maintains strict, long-standing protocols regarding archaeological research conducted at its most significant heritage sites, and any legitimate excavation, scan, or survey typically requires coordination with Egyptian antiquities authorities. According to reporting on the Khafra project's announcement, there was no indication the team had received any such approval before going public with claims this dramatic about one of the most protected archaeological sites on Earth. That's a meaningful procedural gap, one that stands in sharp contrast to how genuinely verified archaeological discoveries at Giza have typically been announced in recent years. There have been genuine verified discoveries at Giza in recent years, which is exactly why this story landed with as much traction as it did. In 2017, an international research collaboration called the Scan Pyramids Project used a completely different, far better established technique called muon radiography, essentially detecting naturally occurring cosmic ray particles called muons as they pass through solid stone with denser material, blocking more muons and empty voids, allowing more of them through. The same basic principle behind a medical X-ray, just using particles that arrive naturally from space rather than being generated artificially. These muons are produced continuously, high in Earth's atmosphere, when cosmic rays from deep space collide with air molecules, and they rain down on the planet's surface constantly, passing through solid rock far more easily than radar signals ever could, which is precisely why this method can reliably probe so much deeper without running into the same signal degradation problem that limits conventional radar. Using that method, cross-checked using multiple independent detector types placed at different locations, around, and even inside the pyramid itself. The Scan Pyramids team confirmed a previously unknown void inside the Great Pyramid of Khufu, measuring at least 100 feet in length, a finding that was published in the peer-reviewed journal Nature and widely accepted throughout the scientific community. Specifically, because the methodology was transparent, the results were independently cross-verified using multiple detection instruments built by entirely separate research groups, and the underlying physics of muon detection is exceptionally well understood and doesn't run into the same depth limitations that plague satellite radar. That same Scan Pyramids project has continued producing genuinely verified findings in the years since, each one following the same careful, cross-checked, peer-reviewed process. In 2023, researchers using this muon-based approach identified a previously unknown corridor within the Great Pyramid, located just behind the monument's main entrance, a discovery that was confirmed using multiple different muon detection technologies and subsequently investigated using a small, specially designed endoscope camera inserted through a tiny existing gap in the stonework, allowing researchers to visually confirm the corridor's existence rather than relying on the radiographic data alone. More recently, in late 2025, the same broader research effort identified air-filled anomalies within the Pyramid of Menkaure that may point toward a second, previously unknown entrance into that pyramid, continuing a now well-established pattern of slow, methodical, independently verified findings, building on top of each other year after year. Separately, Egyptologist Zahi Hawass has publicly discussed an entirely different verified project involving small robotic devices that were used to physically reach and clean out a previously inaccessible 30-meter corridor discovered within the Great Pyramid of Khufu, with Hawass teasing at a book fair appearance in late 2025 that a formal announcement detailing the full contents of that corridor would follow sometime in 2026. According to Hawass, the corridor was identified using scanning technologies combined with physical robotic access, allowing the team to pinpoint its exact location well before any public announcement, with its full contents deliberately withheld until the research could be properly completed and verified. Hawass, notably, used that same appearance to directly reject fringe theories about the pyramid's construction, stating plainly that no extraterrestrial beings or supernatural forces were involved in building them, and instead describing the well-documented ramp systems and quarry logistics ancient Egyptian engineers actually used to move enormous blocks of stone into position over what modern estimates suggest was roughly 20 years of sustained construction. This pattern, real, slow, methodically verified discoveries happening alongside far more dramatic, far less verified viral claims, is exactly why a story like the Khafre project resonated the way it did. It borrowed just enough genuine scientific credibility, real academic titles, a real prior peer-reviewed publication, real satellite radar technology, to feel plausible to a general audience already primed by years of legitimate news coverage about actual voids and corridors being discovered using other, better established techniques. The claim wasn't built entirely from nothing, the way some viral hoaxes are. It was built by stretching a real, if narrow and already controversial, scientific technique far beyond what independent experts in that exact technical field say it's actually capable of demonstrating. It's also worth being honest about something else that emerged during the fact-checking process, because it complicates the picture further rather than simplifying it. Reporting from Snopes and other outlets noted that Corrado Malanga has a well-documented history of public interest in topics like UFOs and alien abduction research, and that some of the enthusiasm surrounding the Khafre project's findings became tangled up with entirely separate, much older fringe theories, including a long-standing idea that the pyramids may have originally functioned as some kind of ancient power-generating structure. None of that background necessarily invalidates every specific technical claim Malanga and his collaborators have made about radar tomography. Scientists are allowed to hold unconventional personal beliefs on entirely separate topics without that automatically disqualifying their work in a different field. But it does help explain why mainstream Egyptologists and geophysicists responded with such immediate, largely unified skepticism, and why outlets specifically known for entertaining fringe and conspiracy-adjacent content, rather than mainstream science journalism, were often the fastest and most enthusiastic to amplify the story without much additional scrutiny. So where does that actually leave us? Not with a confirmed world-changing discovery, not with a simple, cleanly fabricated hoax either. It leaves us with an unverified, methodologically disputed claim made by researchers with some genuine scientific credentials, using a technique that independent experts in the exact relevant field say is being stretched well past its actual physical capabilities, unsupported by any released raw data, unconfirmed by any independent replication, illustrated in its most viral form by what appears to be an AI-generated image rather than an actual radar readout, and never submitted through the kind of peer review process that allows other qualified scientists to properly stress test it. That's not the same thing as experts having no explanation at all. Multiple genuinely qualified experts in radar physics, in Egyptology, in archaeological science more broadly, have offered a remarkably consistent explanation. The claimed depth of penetration isn't physically plausible, given how synthetic aperture radar actually behaves when passing through dense rock. And until the underlying data and methodology are made fully available for independent scrutiny, there's no responsible way to treat this as a confirmed discovery rather than an unverified, headline-friendly hypothesis. That distinction matters enormously, and it's worth sitting with directly, because it's precisely the difference between a story that sounds like science and a story that actually survives scientific scrutiny. Real discoveries at Giza, the 2017 void, the 2023 corridor, the recent Menkaure anomalies, share a specific set of features. They were produced using well-understood, independently verifiable physical principles. They were cross-checked using multiple separate detection instruments or methods. They were published through peer review, where other qualified specialists could examine the actual data and methodology before the findings were widely accepted. The Coffer Project claim, so far, has none of those features. It has a dramatic press conference, viral graphics, enthusiastic amplification across social media and podcasts, with enormous reach, and a prior, narrower peer-reviewed paper that its more recent, far larger claims have not yet matched in terms of transparency or verification. None of this means Malanga, Biondi, and May are necessarily acting in bad faith, and it doesn't mean satellite radar tomography, as a broader field, has nothing legitimate to offer archaeology going forward. Techniques considered fringe or unreliable at one point in scientific history have occasionally, after further refinement and rigorous testing, gone on to become genuinely useful tools, and it's entirely possible some future, more transparent version of this same underlying technology could eventually produce verifiable results. But that validation, if it ever comes, will look exactly like how every other legitimate archaeological discovery at Giza has been validated in recent years. Published data, independent replication, cross-checking against a second physically distinct method, and formal peer review, rather than a single viral press conference and an image that turned out to be generated by artificial intelligence. So if you've seen headlines suggesting scientists made a discovery beneath the Great Pyramid that has genuinely left experts without any explanation, it's worth being precise about what actually happened. Experts do have an explanation, a clear, consistent, physics-based one, and it's simply not the explanation the most viral version of this story wants you to walk away believing. The mystery here was never really about what's buried 2,000 feet beneath the Giza Plateau. It was about how quickly a claim wrapped in real academic credentials, a dramatic press conference, and one compelling AI-generated illustration can travel around the world, gathering millions of views long before the far slower, far less exciting process of actual scientific verification ever gets a chance to catch up.